Harvard Divinity School.
Uses and abuses of power in alternative spiritualities. Implications for spiritual care of patients and communities. April 28, 2023.
Thank you. Hello, everybody in the room and out there. One of the disadvantages of speaking last is that people who come before you say things you were going to say. So you'll pardon me in advance if I'm redundant. But I want to start by thanking and commending Harvard Divinity School for having this program on an important subject and for recognizing in a formal way the realm of the spiritual landscape we're calling alternative spiritualities, which is, a very important piece of modern spirituality that is often dismissed and not taken seriously. And I kind of feel like it vindicated the last 55 years or so of my own life. And my own engagement in what we're calling alternative spiritualities, dating back from when I lived a short walk from here and devouring literature on mysticism and Indian philosophy. Every time I speak on this or write about it, this subject of use and abuse of power, I use this metaphor that has been attributed to the Tibetans, but I've never found confirmation of it, but I like it anyway, that gurus are like fire. If you don't get close enough, you don't get the heat and the light. But if you get too close, you can be burned. And the one thing I've learned over time is that there's no place that is the right closeness for everybody. It's a very individual choice, and it is dynamic one. One of the books I wrote that was mentioned in the introduction, American Veda, covered the history of how the teachings from the East came here and influenced the spiritual landscape. So in that context, I had to research all the spiritual communities and all the gurus who have come here and the impact of them. And in that context, the abuses and the scandals of especially of the 60s and 70s, just they kept turning up. And I ended up in the choice that kind of choices authors have to make. What do I do with all this? And every time I mentioned it in my early drafts, I would be repeating myself. So I just said, well, I'll have to devote a chapter to the whole story, especially of sex scandals. And it ended up being the shortest chapter in the book and the hardest and longest to write, because it's so nuanced and so intricate and so complicated that I wanted to be fair. And in the end, I think I did a good job, because I got angry emails from people who said, you were too kind to those bastards. You should have been tougher. And then on the other hand, I got, how could you say those things about my guru? And that I interviewed hundreds of people for that book. And subsequently, I maintained a strong interest in this for all my other writings and teachings. And so I want to share some of the things that I think we can learn from, especially that period, but it didn't stop. I thought we had learned enough so that the misbehavior of spiritual teachers might lessen, but we're having this conference because that doesn't seem to be the case. And there are many lessons to be to be learned. And I'm just going to mention a few that seem important to me. And one is the range of reactions to scandals or revelations of misbehavior by the devotees themselves. And in every community I looked at, there's this range. On the one extreme, outright denial. My guru would never do such things. The people making those accusations are either deluded or they're out to get something, or they want to destroy my teacher and the community. And in many of those instances, people in that category will represent, be fairly high up in the hierarchy of that organization and circle the wagons, and often then demonize the people making the revelations and the accusations. And that could be really vicious stuff. Less extreme are people who don't entirely deny what happened in the light of evidence. And I'm talking about instances where it's not just rumor, but where there's substantial evidence. They won't deny what happened, but they'll rationalize it and minimize it, explain it away. And often that's coded in spiritual assumptions and, idealization of the guru is maintained, even though they recognize that behavior. But there must be a cosmic reason for it. There must be a higher good, because the guru would never do anything harmful. The guru can't do anything harmful, given the state of awakening and realization that that guru had. So if it was sexual, then the victims, what you think are victims, are really blessed that they had this special status in the eyes of the guru to have received this blessing of that attention. And so there have been people who wished the guru had seduced them, because the ones who were victims, we could say, were blessed. And, you know, there's a cosmic reason for everything. If it was financial abuse, then those people accrued really good karma for supporting the guru in his efforts. And if it was the other kind of abuse, the kind Jeff described, where there was a lot of cruelty and authoritarian rule, then it was all for the good, because it was done to deflate egotism on the part of the disciple and to inculcate discipline, spiritual discipline, and teach vital lessons and so forth. On the other extreme of the spectrum are people who are so enraged by the revelations or even by rumors that they file lawsuits, they launch campaigns to denounce the teacher, and denounce and reject all spiritual pursuits, or, you know, all gurus. And it's an extreme reaction of rage. And often those people will throw out the baby with the bathwater and just give up their own spiritual pursuits because it's all bull. It's, you know, I'm calling BS on the whole spiritual thing, and I'm going, you know, sex, drugs, and rock and roll for me from here on out. That happens. And some people are, you know, less extreme. They're upset, they're disillusioned, they sever their ties to the guru and to the community. They go through their own adjustment to a new reality of their own life, but they don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, and they continue their spiritual search, often just finding the next perfect guru or the more perfect guru instead of the one who turned out to be imperfect, or just quietly going on their way. And in the middle, and I'm hoping, I'd love to see hard research, but I'm hoping it's a bell curve and most people are in the middle. And eventually they get there. Even people from the extremes start to filter into the middle, where there's a range of more sensible and mature reactions. Triggering the kind of thing we're doing here, and that Carter and Jeff alluded to, which is, a rethinking and a reevaluation of the whole dynamic and the whole orientation and the assumptions we made about gurus and about spirituality and about higher consciousness. And on a personal level, a rethinking of each person's own relationship to spiritual teachers, to the spiritual pursuit, how much of themselves they're going to devote to it, what they're willing to do by way of trusting a teacher, and all those things. And those are the healthy responses. And what I kept hearing from those people who come to that place of, reevaluation is the importance of making a distinction between the teachings and the methods and the teacher. It's usually himself, and cultivating a discernment, which is, ironically, a quality that is highly valued in all the Eastern traditions of the use of the intellect and the quality of discernment, viveka, as it's called. Somehow that gets abandoned, and you're not supposed to use your mind. You're supposed to transcend your mind, and there's a revival in many cases of like, well, I just sort of surrendered and took things on faith, but maybe I need to learn to think for myself and to examine evidence and think clearly and use my discernment in the future. But that's the range that we can expect every time abuse surfaces. And I think it's one of the things those of us who care about this have to keep in mind, that there'll always be that kind of range of reactions. And of course, it's on the extremes, as we see in politics and other dimensions, where the most noise is made. But the people in the middle, just quietly go about their way, and we learn from that. The other thing is that, and both Carter and Jeff alluded to this as well, that there's a critical paradox at the heart of this issue, which is that the teachers who attract large followings, they usually have a lot to offer. They're not just charismatic charlatans for the most part. They're usually people of a certain level of evolution themselves, who've learned a lot and have a lot to offer. And while they sometimes make exaggerated promises and, might be narcissistic and exalt their own selves and their own lineages, they do have something to offer. And the thing I heard over and over again from people who have been disciples of misbehaving gurus were, yeah, it turned out that he was human and he was flawed, and it was hard, but I gotten over it. But he changed my life and changed it for the better. I learned a lot, I grew a lot, and I wouldn't do anything differently because of that, even with the pain and even with the disillusionment. So we have to acknowledge that the same person who can misbehave and do harmful things can also be a skillful spiritual teacher and a very knowledgeable spiritual teacher. Some of the ones who misbehaved most egregiously have written books that are extraordinary for their insight and their learning. And, that shouldn't surprise us. Picasso was a horrible person, but, and you can still do good things in the world and contribute, even though that. And that kind of paradox is something we all need to hold. The other thing to keep in mind, among many others, is there are major differences in the types of abuse. We can't just lump everything together. There's a big difference between sexual abuse, financial abuse, the kind of authoritarian behavioral abuse that Jeff was talking about, and sort of cruelty in the disguise of, spiritual discipline. There's intentional abuse. There's unintentional, what we might call misuse of power, where the teacher may not know the harm that's being done, thinking, he or she is doing their best to help people, but be misguided. And then within each form of abuse, there are differences as well. There's a difference between the gurus who had clandestine sexual relations with consenting adults and the ones who, recruited underage girls. Those are big differences. There's a big difference between monks who have clandestine affairs and claim to be celibate and pure, and Joe yoga teacher who's diddling around with some of his students. So there are differences, and we have to acknowledge that. There are differences between gurus who do non-transparent financial things for personal luxuries and gurus who do that sort of thing in order to do something in the third world in a sort of Robin Hood thing of stealing from the rich and to do something worthwhile in Africa or India or something. So all of these are nuances we have to bear in mind. We also have to rethink certain assumptions, and my predecessors here today talked about this, that there was this assumption coming from the assimilation of teachings from the East, especially, although there's a Western equivalent of it, that people of a certain attainment of consciousness, of what we're calling a realization or awakening or enlightenment, that there's a perfect correlation between that and ethical and moral behavior. That was an assumption that was made by a whole lot of us and has been clearly demonstrated to be a faulty assumption. But what is the relationship? Is there any relationship? I think we have to acknowledge that there must be, because the hundreds and hundreds of people that not just that I've interviewed, but that are out there and studied by other people, when you have even glimpses of spiritual awakening, enough to keep you going on the path, these practices, meditative practices, contemplative practices, all the psycho-spiritual practices that the world of alternative spirituality features, they transform people. I was a better person because I took up meditation. There was no question about it. So are my other people. So it's easy to assume that if you keep going and you achieve the highest states that are described, you'll be a perfect human being and you won't make mistakes anymore. And everything you do will be for the cosmic good. And that's what we attribute to the gurus, especially the charismatic ones, who, when it comes as a shock that they had a clandestine life that we would not approve of. But so we have to study that. We have to come to terms with that. We have to come to terms with the healthier ways to be with a spiritual teacher. because we all want to learn from people who know more than we do. And there are healthy ways to learn from them and to approach them and to respect them without surrendering our will and our agency and our personal strength and power. In other words, there are models of student, teacher, or disciple, guru, devotee relationships that need to be articulated and modeled. Do you want a perfect master you're going to surrender to? That's high risk. That's getting perhaps too close to the fire. Or do you want a mentor? Do you want a trusted advisor? Do you want a spiritual companion? What is the model that's acceptable to each person in relating to spiritual authority figures in any tradition? And finally, I think, I think one of the things that could come of conferences like this is the world of alternative spirituality, the world of independent spiritual seeking that the researchers call spiritual but not religious, and that portion of the spiritual landscape that is unaffiliated with traditional religions or any of the traditional labels, that is here to stay. This is not going away. Every time there's a survey, a bigger percentage of the population identifies with that. People are taking charge of their own spiritual lives. That's risky. It's, but it's independent. And those people, which probably include many of them who are tuned in here, especially the young seekers, the new seekers, they need support and they need guidance. They need to be empowered and educated. And there's an infinite number of resources available to those people, but some of it is bogus and some of it is good and some of it is hard to come by. If there are ways to guide those people and at least have a structure of some sort or structures where those people can go and learn what to expect as spiritual seekers and be educated about the vulnerabilities that they carry as they approach spiritual teachers and what to look for and what to be careful about. This could be a very helpful thing, and I would hope that something like that can evolve. And the other aspect of that is spiritual teachers, both the ones who are part of lineages and part of organizations, but especially those who are independent and functioning on their own, of which there are, ever-growing numbers of, sort of self-anointed spiritual teachers, some of whom are, very learned and very well-meaning, and others of whom are out to make a buck or become famous. They too need support and help. And especially the independent ones who are on their own. And if they're well-meaning, they could use what my colleagues in the Association for Spiritual Integrity, which I commend you, everybody, to look into. They could use community. They could use peer support. They could use help. And they need accountability. And this world of independent seekers and independent teachers is, I think, has great potential for personal and collective transformation, but it's risky. And these communal sort of safeguards and support systems, I think, are terribly important. And spiritual teachers, I think, need to be perhaps persuaded that it's a good idea to pay attention to their behavior and their ethics, and to the importance of publicly adopting a code of ethics and sticking to it, and of being careful of their own, attending to their own psychology. And of course, the ones who need to be reminded of that most are the people who don't think they have to be bothered with such stuff. But the more, because they're above it and they're just doing God's will and don't bother me with right and wrong and other foolish dualities. I'm coming from a higher place. Those will be the ones who need this most, but will be the last to be persuaded. But perhaps they can be persuaded when they realize it's in their own self-interest. Because if they don't pay attention, the roof's going to cave in one day when they misbehave and they're, sued and denounced publicly and everything else. So those are the things I have come away from my experience, and there's much more to be learned, but I want to thank again Harvard Divinity School for having this program and inviting us. And I hope the conversation continues. Thanks.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, President and Fellows of Harvard College.